Ever since the end of World War II, the world has been shaped in a way that has been based on the reaction to that conflict. After the war's conclusion, we had a pretty clear idea of who the good guys and who the bad guys were. Other than just the history is written by the victors effect, the losers of World War II have been almost religiously treated as the pure exemplification of evil in the world, considering every nation involved had directly or indirectly facilitated some of the worst human rights atrocities in history. From Japan's Bataan Death March and human experimentation at Unit 731, to the most infamous example of genocide ever committed in the world, the Holocaust being carried out by Nazi Germany. Based on those facts alone, the absolute obsession to stomp out any instances of the sentiments that led to these things happening seems justified. I mean, obviously the entire idea is to prevent any of these atrocities from ever happening again, which in and of itself is a pretty noble cause. However, since the war's conclusion, flaws in this societal mission have arisen. Much of our focus hasn't actually been put on the ideologies that got us there, but rather the complete vilification of one specific culprit. I'm of course talking about Nazi Germany. Germany received the brunt of the world's hatred since the end of the Second World War for obvious reasons, but it's gotten to the point now where the mere act of showing a swastika in a World War II setting is seen as controversial by many, when obviously it's just historically accurate. If you're in Germany at any time between 1933 and 1945, you're probably going to see swastikas. Like, literally everywhere. And this is sometimes taken even a step further by painting the Nazis as incompetent fools that had absolutely no idea what they were doing. This societal taboo of a historical event and this portrayal of Nazis as incompetent fools can actually have some very dangerous consequences for society going forward. Now, before we get into things, I feel a quick disclaimer is in order. Now, this should be fairly obvious for anybody who understands what the intent of this video is, but for those who don't, I am in no way saying that the Nazis were good and that they should be viewed in a positive light. This video is intended to shine a light on how we view the Nazis and how it's become disconnected from reality and history, and how that disconnect can actually cause damage to society going forward. So, with that out of the way, let's get into it. As I said before, the world as we know it today was largely shaped by the events of the Second World War. We can see this in everything from Europe's decolonization to America's current world hegemony. In fact, you'd be hard-pressed to find one aspect of the world that we're currently living in that wasn't either directly or indirectly affected by the outcome of World War II. I mean, if Japan and America never went to war, it's possible that Korea and a good chunk of China would still be Japanese colonies. Likewise, had Nazi Germany decided not to execute the final solution, then it's totally possible that after their defeat, the world's moral framework would have probably stayed the same. I mean, let's look at the end of World War I. Germany lost that war too, and other than being treated kind of poorly at the hands of the Treaty of Versailles, for the most part, Germany was just treated as a whatever defeated nation, not so much the national pariah that it was after World War II. And the kinder, gentler societies that we know of today might not have ever been formed. While this is a rabbit hole and a half that we could go down and make an entire video about in and of itself, suffice it to say, such a major world event that left most of the developed world in shambles after its conclusion only makes sense that a lot of things would have to change to try to prevent a repeat of that event. And because said event was basically seen as the beginning of the world that we live in today, it's made a perfect playground for those seeking to write stories. I think it's no secret that since the end of World War II, there's been a couple of stories that have taken place in it. Everything from movies, TV shows, books, video games, and yes, even YouTube videos. This media can range from being historically accurate or at least faithful to being completely over the top and outrageous. For example, movies like Saving Private Ryan put heavy emphasis on being faithful to each event, maybe not being 100% historically accurate, but you know, close enough. And then you have things like Quentin Tarantino's Inglourious Basterds, which is an over-the-top, quote, revenge fantasy that paints the Nazis as sadistic, incompetent, irredeemable fools easily taken down by a small group of Americans. And now I could go on for hours about how this movie portrays things absolutely in the most ludicrous way possible, from the fact that we're pretty much painting the good guys as the bad guys. I don't know about you, but like seeing somebody evil laughing while they burn down an entire theater and then gun innocent people leaving the theater seems like they're the bad guys, or the fact that we thought that it was a good idea to have a small group of Americans gun down Hitler in a theater completely unguarded by anybody. I digress, this isn't a movie review channel, but the one thing that these pieces of media do have in common is that they dehumanize the Nazis. One of the things that I feel like we forget as a society is that not every single person in Nazi Germany was immediately complicit in the Holocaust or any of the bad things that Nazi Germany did. Normal German soldiers that were on the front lines shooting at Allied soldiers were pretty much doing what they had to do to ensure that they weren't shot for insubordination. We like to sit there and point and say, hey, following orders isn't an excuse, but for all they knew, the Axis was winning, especially early on in the war. Now mind you, I also understand that not every piece of media is going to be able to get into every single background character's backstory and show what kind of people they are, but I think the point still stands. Every single piece of media, from Call of Duty to Indiana Jones, paints the Nazis as kind of this faceless, nameless enemy that you're supposed to shoot and not question why. Or most recently for Call of Duty, they treat the Nazis as this evil, cartoonish villain that's better fit in a James Bond movie rather than a historical setting. But all of this writing style comes about because showing anything from the Nazis' perspective is extremely taboo unless it's highly caricatured. Which, as mentioned before, is because most of modern society was formed around the idea that Nazis were the purest form of evil, nothing could ever be worse, and that there was nothing at all redeemable about them. But obviously, history is hardly ever that black and white. I think this idea that the Nazis being the single most evil thing in the world leads many to not understand how they got into power in the first place. It's pretty safe to say that a vast majority of people going about their daily lives don't really care about educational topics like history, seeing as how it's kind of seen as boring or bland. So since that is the case, most people go throughout their entire lives with the only history they know being what they've seen in movies. Therefore, unless you're some level of a history buff, most people either don't know how the Nazis came into power or just assume that they forced their way into power, quickly subjugating everybody that they ruled over. Which, obviously that's not true. The Nazis tried doing that in the 1923 Beer Hall Push, but needless to say, that didn't exactly go down well for them. German troops put down the insurrection, killed hundreds of prospective Nazis, injured the future Luftwaffe commander Hermann Göring, and arrested several high-ranking Nazi leaders, including Adolf Hitler himself. It wasn't actually until 10 years later when the Nazis actually seized power, and it took political maneuvering, appealing to people, and satisfying current democratically elected officials and societal elites. Now, I'm sure for everyone watching this, that's probably pretty common knowledge, but for the average person going about their lives not really caring how we got here, all they know about the Nazis is that they started and fought World War II, were racist towards anyone who wasn't a blonde-haired, blue-eyed white person, and committed one of the worst mass murders in all of history. Which, if we're being fair, is probably some of the more notable things that they did. And it's good to know that people at least know some of the worst things that they did to try to not repeat them. But it's this lack of understanding that prevents anyone from highlighting the few actually good things the Nazis achieved, again for fear of being labeled a Nazi sympathizer and losing all credibility. Few people realize that under Nazi tenureship, the Germans were able to lift themselves out of the Great Depression, solve hyperinflation, begin construction on the Autobahn, develop their first cost-effective car, and were even fairly environmentalist and supported animal rights. This inability to show how and why people sympathized with fascism back in the day, or just general disinterest in showing other examples of fascist human rights atrocities happening, i.e. Japan's Unit 731 in popular media, leaves us with this very black and white simplistic idea that the Nazis are bad and that's all there is to it. When obviously there is a little bit more to it than that. And we've seen this sentiment grow more and more in popular media, where now you really can't release any form of World War II media without feeling like it could be a little bit too offensive to show anything pertaining to Nazi Germany. Like, you can't even have Axis-themed teams in a World War II shooter anymore without having to worry about the internet accusing you of calling them a Nazi for no reason. And I mean, this overbearing taboo has even made its way into school systems. Speaking from personal experience, I wasn't taught anything pertaining to World War II until I was a junior in high school, years after I was first introduced to the concept of Nazis via video games or movies. And if you ask a lot of teachers, it's due to the fact that teaching children dark parts of history isn't exactly appropriate for their age group, which I guess to an extent I agree with. Obviously, kindergartners don't need to know about genocide. However, I feel like we should be making a concerted effort to have kids understand why such a fundamental part of modern society is the way it is. You know, sometime before they're almost a legal adult. Now, this next thing I'm going to say will probably make some of you do a double take, considering I've been talking down on it this entire time, but hear me out. Taboos aren't innately a bad thing. When it comes to running a functional society, there does have to be some level of unspoken rules in order to make sure that we don't fall into total chaos. A perfect example of why this can be necessary is the introduction of alcohol to Native American people. Since Native American peoples never had any interaction with the substance, societal taboos were never formed in order to control how much alcohol you consume. Therefore, after a lot of Native peoples were introduced to alcohol, many of them became drunkards and alcoholics. So, if they actually had social taboos in this case, that could have prevented them from falling into greater pitfalls that would have harmed them later on in life, i.e., alcoholism. However, where the cracks begin to show is when societal taboos get to be treated like a religious commandment that cannot be questioned for fear of being shunned by that society. Unfortunately though, this kind of thing is extremely common across history and usually leads to some kind of powerful reaction to it, completely nullifying the taboo in the first place. In short, a rebellion. Well, like I said, there are countless examples of this across history. A very good and more recent example is the sexual revolution. Centuries-long taboos surrounding sex in the Western world had created this very prudish society. Now, a lot of people think that this taboo was made to try to prevent people from dying of syphilis back in the 1400s before people really understood what syphilis was. But regardless of what the reason was, we ended up with this basic societal foundation that promiscuous sex is evil, which created sexual taboos that were so intense that women couldn't ask their doctors basic questions about their anatomy without being told, "Oh, you don't need to know that," or "Oh, you'll learn about that when you're older," when these women were like 25. And this continued clear into like the mid to late 60s. This unwavering devotion to prudery eventually led to the masses becoming so fed up that they caused a revolution which broke down centuries of sexual norms in order to allow for free love, open discussions about sex, and even depicting sex in the media during the late 60s and early 70s. Now, to an extent, the sexual revolution was a bit of a good thing. We needed to try to find a much more realistic and balanced place for sex in our society, and the sexual revolution did do a good job of breaking down a lot of strict taboos that really didn't have places in our modern society. However, this balanced approach is not really what happened. Such a radical overnight change allowed for the generation who started this movement to have a ton of sex, while also creating this unspoken rule that having a high body count is a bit of a status symbol, which then led to the use of low trust methods like ghosting or not taking no for an answer. All of this eventually culminated in future generations having less social trust and therefore less sex due to the insane culture surrounding it, which then later exacerbated population decline. Where am I going with this? Well, the point that I'm trying to make is since the sexual revolution was a rebellion against social norms being severely overbearing, it pushed too far in the other direction and ended up causing a lot of problems. Now, I posit that the same principle could apply to our society's current taboo of the Nazis. Like I've said ad nauseum before in this video, almost every single aspect of the Nazis is becoming a bit too taboo to talk about, with even the basics such as showing swastikas in Nazi Germany during World War II becoming a massively contentious topic in recent years. This taboo is starting to approach levels of absurdity like the ones we saw leading up to the sexual revolution. Now, mind you, on a much quicker timescale. The biggest thing that I fear with modern society having a single-minded focus on the Nazis are bad, we should do everything to be the complete opposite of what the Nazis did, we may start to see a fascination with the very ideas that led to Nazism, especially given that the education of what the Nazis truly were or how they got into power has kind of gone down also in recent years. A combination of lessening education, extreme social taboos, and a larger and larger group of people being disgruntled at the world system due to economic iniquity and overbearing social policies pushed by, honestly, leftist politicians, is kind of a recipe for disaster when you look at it through the lens of possible rebellion. In fact, we can kind of already see the beginning of this. The existence of radical far-right parties were honestly very few and far between a few years ago when the social justice philosophy wasn't as pervasive. But now a massive subsect of the Republican Party is unwaveringly devoted to only one man who promises them the world, and the alt-right is growing bigger and bigger. It's actually crazy. While doing some research for this video, I didn't realize just how many neo-Nazi movements there have been across the world since the end of World War II. Now, most of them haven't gotten very far and are extremely limited in scope, but it does show that there is at least a fascination with that ideology still. However, despite its very limited scope, it is possible that sometime in the future we could see a sizable resurgence of Nazi ideology, driven off of a combination of ignorance to the depth of their crimes, a desire to push back on the foundations of the post-World War II system, and the desire to rebel against overbearing societal taboos surrounding them. Now, this might not come in the form of outright Nazism, but the incorporation of ideas that originate from Nazism into their movements. Either way, I don't think I have to be the one here to say that that would be extremely dangerous for society going forward if that became the case. After all, as we all know, there was a reason that there are no more fascist dictatorships from that time still existing today. And more importantly, there is a reason the Nazis did lose World War II. Either way, society pushing for such a complete taboo of something as important as the Nazis being evil carries significant risk with it by causing ignorance and giving reason for rebellion. And if left unchecked, it could inadvertently cause the perpetuation of Nazi ideology down the line, effectively nullifying the entire point of the taboo in the first place. Instead, we should seek to educate, show people that these were human beings led by ignorance and false promises, rather than demons out of the Bible. If people have a greater understanding of how we got there as a society, then maybe it'll be a lot easier to prevent those things from being perpetuated in the future, thus taking a much more balanced approach to our shared societal mission to prevent something like the Nazis from ever happening again.